All right, it's 12 o'clock. I think we are live. Yes, we are live. And so if you are joining us here today or just now jumping on, we're so excited that you're here. Would love to know who you are. So throw in your name and where you are joining us from. My name is Morgan Adams. I am in Austin, Texas. I am the vice president of Seller Shield and here to help make this a great webinar experience for you. And today our presenter is Bo Blackburn, who is the founder and the COO of Seller Shield, also real estate attorney extraordinaire, and will be sharing with us today our presentation on anatomy of a lawsuit. So I will go ahead and pass it on to Bo.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I see we've got people chiming in from a bunch of different locations. I just saw somebody from Montana, New York, and I think California, if I saw that right. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to spend a little time with you today talking about a really fun stuff, lawsuits. If y'all were all here, I bet I would be getting a lot of fake applause to talk about lawsuits. But we're here today to talk about something I call the anatomy of a lawsuit. And obviously I'm taking a little liberties with the college course thing, the anatomy of this, the anatomy of that. But at a really high level, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what a normal residential real estate lawsuit looks like. We're going to break it down into its core elements. And we're going to give you a few pointers on how to never end up in a residential real estate lawsuit. So that's our high level goal today. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about me so you can understand, should I really listen to this guy? Does he know anything about lawsuits? So let me tell you a little bit about my background. I'm a roughly, almost 27-year lawyer now. And most of the time I've been a lawyer, I have been representing real estate agents and brokers in the state of Texas and helping them when they find themselves in a residential real estate lawsuit. In addition to that, I am the founder of Seller Shield, which is sole purpose is to help real estate agents and sellers avoid being in lawsuits. And then I finished my term on the what's called the Broker Lawyer Committee. That is a committee within the Texas Real Estate Commission, TREC. It is a committee that is responsible for promulgating new forms and maintaining existing forms that are required to be used in the state of Texas to handle real estate transactions. If that's not enough, I hope that is, but if that's not enough about background for me, my father is a real estate broker. My mom, very briefly, was a licensee with my father until they decided that they couldn't work together. So if that's not enough, my wife is a real estate lawyer, and she owns and operates about 10 different title companies in the state of Texas. So in the Blackburn family, we pretty much eat, sleep, and then dream about real estate. And I'll tell you what we've been dreaming about lately is lower rates. I suspect I'm probably in good company there. But we're all doing, we're surviving until the rates come back. So that's a little bit about me. Now a little bit about anatomy of a lawsuit. And let me flip the switch here. Make sure I'm doing that right. Okay, y'all heard that. So just super high level here. I know this is me kind of preaching to the choir, or it's definitely me preaching to the choir. We have seen a rise at Seller Shield. I've seen it in my law firm. My wife's seen it in her title companies. My dad's seen it at brokerage. And I bet you guys have too. We've seen a rise in mediations and disputes related to home sales, really starting, and this is no surprise for anybody who's been in the industry and understands how this happens, really when the shift happened. When we went from hyperdrive right after COVID to downshifting in late 2023 to kind of where we are now, we started to see a rise in disputes, which is totally normal. Like I said, I've been doing this almost 27 years, and there's always a baseline level of disputes and lawsuits and residential real estate transactions. But what happens is sometimes we see a big spike in lawsuits. And there's a couple of things that causes that. The one that I want to reference and the one that I think we're living in now is anytime you have a big shift, blowing and going like we were in 2020, 2021, and 2022, and then the brakes come on. Well, that's almost always, and it almost always has caused a spike in claims. And then here's, just some data that you can see that demonstrates that. And then I can't help, but I love the one from Florida Realtors. Sue thy neighbor. Homeowner spats get nastier. That is so true. And I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny, but I love the way they phrase that headline there. What we're going to do here is hopefully put you in a position where you're not in one of those nasty spats. Okay. Enough of that. Let me flip the switch here. Okay. What we're going to do here, like I said, in the anatomy of a lawsuit, is we're going to take a claim. We're going to break it down into its core components. And the first thing we're going to talk about is who are the folks that are in a residential lawsuits, the participants. And the participants in a normal residential real estate lawsuit are, we start with the buyer. The buyer is the one who is almost always, and I mean almost always, we're talking like 99% of the time, the buyer is the one that feels aggrieved, feels like they've been wronged. They're the ones that is bringing the complaint. Well, who are they upset with? Well, the first person they're upset with is the seller. And I'm going to stop there for a second because I hope that just makes so much sense that everybody's like, duh. That makes total sense, because what you have is you have the seller selling their property. In other words, they're handing the keys to somebody else and they're walking away from their property and they get cash. And the buyer is giving cash and then they're moving into this asset, this house. Well, if you think about that, who is the one that's likely going to be upset in that transaction? What does the seller have to be upset about after closing? They've given their keys, which they knew they were going to do. That they therefore have no more problems with that home because they don't live there, they don't own it. And if they received their cash, which they do, is a condition to handing over their keys, what in the world are they going to be upset about? Nothing. So think about it the other way. The buyer is typically borrowed money or written a check, and they've received the keys and they've moved in. Well, under that big picture scenario, who is the one that's most likely to be the problem, the one that's most likely to bring a claim? Well, it's obvious it's the buyer. And who are going to be the parties to that claim? Well, that should be obvious too. Who are the two parties to the transaction? The buyer and the seller. So I hope that's kind of, I don't know if you've ever thought about it that way, but I hope that's kind of a duh or an aha moment. Well, of course, the buyer is going to be the one that's going to bring the claim. And of course, the seller is going to be the one that they're going to be mad at. It just makes logical sense if you really think about it that way. Okay, who are the other participants? The normal sort of secondary people that the buyer is mad about is the listing agent / listing brokerage, the brokerage that represented the seller. Then right after that, if we had a hierarchy, seller would be at top, listing brokerage would be number 2, and then the buyer's broker would be number 3, and then a distant fourth would be the home inspector, and they're a distant fourth. And we'll get into why those parties are brought in a little bit, but those are the participants. Now let's talk a little bit about the typical factual scenario. And I think I'm going to go back one here. Yeah. The typical factual scenario that we see in the dispute is you have a normal transaction where a buyer and seller close and really nothing out of the ordinary happens. I'm going to pause for a second and let that sink in because that should alarm you a little bit. I bet most of you would go, well, what do you mean? It's a normal transaction and nobody's really upset? Yeah. That's our typical start of a residential real estate lawsuit. So the buyer closes, moves in, and lives in the property for some period of time. Then after some period of time, they discover a property defect. And this concept of a property defect is really important in understanding how these claims arise and understanding how to avoid being dragged into one. Some type of property defect, and there's all, I mean, you can imagine, you guys are in the business, there's all different kinds of property defects. There's roof leaks, there's water penetration, there's from rain, there's plumbing problems, there's mold, there's foundation problems, you name it. I mean, you guys know how many property defects there are with the home. So there's the buyer moves in, lives in the house for some period of time, and at some point discovers a property defect. that they claim the seller and the listing agent knew about and failed to disclose it. That's the core factual dispute that I've seen in the last 27 years as a lawyer representing agents and sellers. And that's what we at Seller Shield try to help our sellers and their listing agents avoid. But that's our typical factual scenario. And the biggest property defect that we see over and over and over again, if you break it down to its core, is water. And I'm going to let you think about that for a second. And if you think about it, again, it should make a ton of sense. What is a home? Another way to describe a home is shelter. What is the home sheltering you from? The elements. What is the one element that it is hopefully sheltering you from the most? You know, depending on where you are. If you're in Montana today, it's probably hopefully sheltering you from the cold. But water is the big thing that your home shelters you from. It is designed to keep water out. And when water is not kept out, it comes in and causes problems, which are the ones that we see cause litigation problems over and over again. You know, you have a roof leak. You have water, when it rains, you have water flooding into the property. When it rains too much or not enough, you have foundation movement, which causes the foundation to move and the roof to crack and accept the sheetrock to crack, et cetera, et cetera. But at the core of a lot of the claims we see, water is the culprit. Okay, so what have we done so far? We know who the participants are in our normal residential real estate lawsuit. We know what the typical factual scenario is. Let me go back to my cheat sheet here. I think our next one is legal claims asserted. Now, let me give a little disclaimer here. This is, I'm not expecting any of you to understand this as a lawyer. This is not what this class is. This is a high-level class to understand how it happens and then to learn a few simple things to avoid the problem. So I only put this up here just so you're familiar with this language. You don't need to understand it much more than just be familiar with it. So legal claims that we typically see that are asserted against the seller and the listing agent, listing brokerage are these right here: fraud in a real estate transaction, negligent type claims, deceptive trade practice type claims, treble damages. But if you really kind of boil all this kind of legal mumbo jumbo down, you can boil it down into one word. And what the core claim that the buyer is making against the seller and the listing agent is that they misrepresented. What? What did they misrepresent? Well, if you were paying attention to how we talked about what is the typical factual scenario, the claim from the buyer against the seller and the listing broker is that they misrepresented the status of the property. And I will just use an example here. They move in, there's a roof leak, and the buyer is claiming that the seller and the listing agent represented that the roof was in good condition and never had any leaks. And they're saying that's a misrepresentation. And that's the core of the legal claims that are being made. And again, you don't need to know any of this fraud stuff. I was about to curse, but I probably shouldn't. You don't need to know any of this stuff. You just need to remember misrepresentation, that the buyer is saying that the seller and the listing agent misrepresented. Okay, let's move on. I think it's helpful if we dig a little bit deeper into one of these claims, and it's the fraud claim. And again, you're going to see it's about misrepresentation, but let me tell you why it can be boiled down to misrepresentation. When a buyer sues for fraud, they have to prove these four, they're called elements in our world. They have to prove these four things for them to be able to win. Number one, a material representation that was false. Okay, let's do a little audience participation here real quick. Let's see if y'all are awake. If you put that in layman's terms, what does that sound like? A material representation that was false. Morgan, I think you're watching the comments and chats there. Let me know if anybody gets it right. Come on now, let's do audience participation.
Waiting.
All right, Bueller, do we have are people here? A material representation that was false. I'm going to tell you. I'm going to give you the. I'm going to give you the short version. There you go, Leslie Wright. There you go. Thank you, Leslie. It sounds like a lie. A material representation that was false. So why do I want to drive that home? The reason I want to drag that home is I want you to get a little flavor of what these claims are like to be a seller or an agent that's brought into one. And what I'm talking about is the buyer is saying that you're a liar. And that's what they get up in front of the judge and the jury and say. They say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this real estate agent and this seller lied. Okay, so that's the first thing they have to prove to win on a fraud case. So it's personal. These disputes are ugly. My clients hate being in them, not just because it's a lawsuit, but because how ugly the allegations are. And they say this real estate agent lied to get paid. And that's what they argue over and over and over again. Okay, let's go on to the second element. Is the seller and the listing broker knew they were lying, or they were so negligent in something they said that we should count it as a lie. You know, they didn't do anything that they should have, that they would have discovered it was a lie. That's kind of the second part. Then the third element is they intended to induce. The lie was made for the purpose of getting the buyer to close. And then the fourth they have to prove is the buyer relied on the lie. Okay. Again, do I want you all to remember these four elements? If I could see you now, or would I see you guys writing them down? You don't need to write them down. The only thing you need to remember is the one word, and that one word is misrepresentation. In other words, the buyer is saying that the seller and the listing agent misrepresented something. The buyer relied on that misrepresentation, and they purchased the home as a result of that. Okay, that's fraud. Let's go. Let's keep going. We're making good time here. Let's keep going. We have covered, in terms of our, what are we going to go over? We've covered who are the participants. We've talked about the legal claims. We've talked about the normal factual scenario. And now we're going to talk about who in the world is Bo and what in the heck does Bo do, you know? Bo is a catch-all for the lawyer who represents you, the real estate agent, because that's what I've done for 27 years. So who is Bo and what does Bo do? Well, Bo tries to get the real estate agents out of the lawsuit. That's what he does. So how does he do it? All right. I give what I think is a super silly, super dumb hypothetical here, because I think it helps. You know, when you do super silly stuff, I think sometimes when I was in law school, when my professors would give us silly stuff, I could remember that. When they would give us really dry, boring stuff, hell, I couldn't remember it to save my life. So I'm giving you something silly and dumb on purpose. Okay. And it's based on a commercial that I saw, I don't know, 10 years ago, something. It's been a while now, but there was this commercial where this family was, you know, a wife or kids were asking the dad, hey, can we go do something? I don't even remember what it was. And the dad said, oh, our money tree's not blooming. And he laughed like a dorky dad laugh. And they didn't think it was funny, but I thought it was hilarious. And then for years, anytime my kids would ask me to do something, I would say, oh, our money tree's not blooming right now. And I thought it was funny and they didn't. But that's the background for this money tree thing. Okay, so what is our hypothetical? Our hypothetical is you have a inspection, a pre-closing inspection occurring at a property, and the people that are present at the inspection are the inspector and the buyer and the seller. No one else is there. And at some point during the inspection, the buyer and seller, they sit down at the kitchen table and they're, you know, talking about the house, talking about life, talking about their families. And at one point the seller goes, you know, did my real estate agent tell you about the money tree? And the buyer goes, no, I don't know anything about your money tree. In fact, I don't know what a money tree is. And the seller goes, oh, it's fabulous. Every spring it blooms $5 bills. I love it. I've actually hired an arborist to see if I can, pull it out and take it with me to my next house. But unfortunately, you can't transplant it. So it's one of the things I love about the house, and it's one of the things you're going to love. And the buyer goes, well, that sounds pretty good. I'd like to have a tree that blooms $5 bills. Sounds great. And they, start talking about other stuff. Again, I told you I could see Morgan laughing. It's dumb. It's supposed to be dumb. It's going to illustrate a point. All right. So transaction closes, and it's a normal transaction that closes. Buyer moves in, and this is in November. Buyer moves in, and, not really, the tree's not blooming, of course. There's no $5 bills on it because it's November. Well, November goes by, December goes by, January, et cetera, et cetera. And we get to February, and then the buyer goes, man, I'm kind of excited about these $5 bills that I'm going to start plucking off this tree, and starts waking up in the morning and walking out every morning and has a cup of coffee and walks outside and examines the tree. And every morning, no $5 bills. And he's thinking, well, it's no big deal. It's February, probably not blooming yet. The other trees aren't blooming either. So I'll just check it every day. And lo and behold, March comes and goes. No $5 bills. Other trees are blooming at this point. April comes and goes. No $5 bills. And every single morning, first thing the buyer who's moved into the house does, gets a cup of coffee, walks outside, and is disappointed every single morning. So February, March, April roll by. And finally in May, our buyer's had enough. Calls his agent, says, do you know anything about this? Can you look into it? And the agent says, what? It's like, I don't know anything about this. No, I can't look into this. And so at that point, he calls a lawyer. He does what unhappy lawyers do. And he gets the lawyer to sue the seller and the listing agent. And I'm going to have to hurry up because we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to accelerate, although I love this story. The real estate agent goes and hires a Bo, and the Bo says, okay, tell me about this. And the listing agent says, I don't know a damn thing about this money tree. Never heard of it. Wasn't involved in it. Didn't say a word about it. And the Bo files what's called a summary judgment. It's just a motion to get in front of the court and get the case dismissed. And what happens at this point is Bo gets up in front of the judge and does the song and dance. And he basically says, Judge, I don't represent anybody but the listing agent. Some people here may have some problems, but my client doesn't. And at that point, makes the argument that if there was a misrepresentation, and what this lawyer will do is he'll have this screen right here up in front of the judge, and he'll make an argument that says, look, Judge, the buyer can't prove these elements against my client, the listing agent. Might be able to prove it against somebody else, but not against my client, because my client didn't lie. My client didn't say anything about this money tree. My client didn't know anything about the money tree. My client wasn't present at the inspection when this conversation took place. My client had nothing to do with this. And in our hypothetical money tree scenario, the judge goes, Blackburn, you're right. Case dismissed. And I'm a hero. Real estate agent gets out, and all is right in the world for the real estate agent. That's money tree. Now let's do not a silly one. Let's do an actual one that's not silly. Let's do one that we see over and over again. And then we're going to compare and contrast money tree to a real world example. So our real world example is, you have a transaction, the buyer and the seller don't interact other than just normal interaction. There's no silly money tree, but the buyer receives a completed disclosure notice and he reviews it. And one thing that is not noteworthy is there's no mention of problems with roof or roof leaks. Buyer moves in November, no rain. Buyer lives there in December, no rain. Buyer lives there in January, no rain. You get the point. We roll around to March or so and we start getting some real rains, and lo and behold, the roof leaks. Our buyer wakes up with a roof leak on day one, wakes up with the same roof leak on day two, et cetera, et cetera. They live with it. The point is they live with the problem and they become very frustrated by the problem. And they, get their agent involved with no satisfaction. And then they go to a lawyer and then they sue the seller and the listing agent. And again, Bo represents the listing agent, and Bo says to the listing agent, hey, I'm going to do money tree. I'm going to file a motion for summary judgment. I'm going to show the judge that you shouldn't be involved in this. I'm going to make this argument. And Bo gets up and makes this argument. It says, Judge, my client, blah, 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 just makes the money tree argument. My client didn't make a representation about the roof. My client didn't know anything about the roof. My client never discussed the roof with the seller or the buyer. My client had no communication with the buyer or their agent about the roof. So, there may be somebody here that has a problem, Judge, but it isn't my client. And then what I do is I pivot and I talk about the disclosure notice, and I point out some key facts about the disclosure notice. And I'd love to do some give and take, but we don't have time. What I argue about the disclosure notice is two key things. Number one, I say, and I make a big deal of this. I'm very theatrical when I'm in front of a judge. I make a big deal and I say, Judge, what's this dadgum thing called? And I pause and I go, Judge, this is called the seller's, and I pause again, disclosure notice. Judge, what is this thing not called? Do you notice, Judge, that it's not called the seller and the real estate agent disclosure notice? And for our friends that are in California, I know what this doesn't fully translate for you guys, but it does for everybody else. Sorry, California. And I make that argument to point out that if there is a misrepresentation, that the misrepresentation is made by the seller and not the agent. And that's the core point I want to get across. And there's other things I can say, but we don't have time to go into the weeds on that. So that is what I want to get us to our takeaway. Our takeaway here is when you are a listing agent and you're representing a seller, you need to make sure that you are not making a misrepresentation about a property defect. And we need to understand, where do representations come from about the property? Because if we know where they come from, then you may have a red flag going off in your head, and you go, okay, I need to be really cautious when I'm dealing with this. Well, most representations about the property come from the disclosure notice. And the disclosure notice almost always is supposed to be filled out by the seller. So our key takeaway is make sure that you don't do anything that can make you be attached to the disclosure notice. And what I'm talking about is, number one, don't fill it out. Years and years ago, we had agents that were literally filling out the disclosure notice for their seller. Don't be present when it's filled out, and do your best to have nothing to do with it being filled out. So we're running really short on time, so I'm going to transition, because that's a good launching point to transition to talk about why seller shields exist. Because the reason it exists is to address this very issue that we've spent the last 27 minutes on. The reason that we have our disclosure tool with Seller Shield is to separate you, the agent, from the one document that causes problems for both the seller and you, the agent. So we want to be able to put the Bos of the world in a position for you, the real estate agent, to protect you from these types of claims. So our disclosure tool, our gold standard disclosure process, think TurboTax, but instead of for taxes, it's for disclosure documents. We have, example answers, we have tips, definitions, etc. When we guide the seller through the disclosure process, think about that as doing two things. Number one, it creates some separation for you, the agent, from the document that is the most dangerous document in the transaction. And that's the disclosure notice. So that's one thing it does. Because agents ask me all the time, well, what does this do for me? That's what it does for you, is it creates separation from the disclosure, which is the document that has the misrepresentations. The second thing it does is it helps the seller to disclose properly. As I said, we have example answers in there, we have tips, but one of the most important things we have in our disclosure tool is we tell the seller before they fill it out, or I'm sorry, while they're filling it out, hey, this question right here, and I'm going to use roof leaks as an example because that's what we've been talking about. We tell the seller when they're answering that very question that this question leads to disputes if not answered correctly. We don't tell them that on all the questions. In fact, we tell them that on a very small number of questions because that's the truth. So imagine the monkey with symbols. I don't know if y'all remember that. I may be too old. But what we're doing is we're putting the monkey with symbols on the questions in the disclosure notice that cause problems. That's the second thing we do. And then when we do that, the seller gets it right. And when they get it right, there's nothing for the buyer to be upset about. And then there's no claim against you, the agent. Okay. I think we have an extra couple of minutes. Morgan, I think Tina said we had an extra 5 minutes. So I'm going to take them. I'm going to take them. The other thing that we do at Seller Shield is home sale legal protection. Think E&O. As you guys know, y'all have E&O to protect you from claims. The seller has no protection from claims. So what we do at Seller Shield is we offer something called home sale legal protection to give the seller some protection from claims regarding the sale of their home. And it's a pretty cool product. A lot of sellers like that when they're presented it. We get about 1 in 3 sellers when they have the opportunity to opt into our home sale legal protection, they opt into it. Our disclosure tool, which you all at EXP, this is something that you all have access to completely free for you. I want to be really clear. Disclosure tool, completely free for you, completely free for your seller. No matter what, it's completely free for both of you. Home sale legal protection is how we make our money. That's how we can operate as a company. That costs money. And when the seller is filling out their disclosure documents, they're presented with an opportunity to opt in. They don't have to buy it. And if they don't buy it, they still get to use the disclosure tools for free. So those are our 2 core products. And like I said, I've been talking a lot. Morgan, we have any questions you want me to go over?
No, just get to the last page where they can sign up, please.
Okay, let me get there. All right. Whew, that's a mouthful. I appreciate, I think I did see a good question about how long does the buyer have to bring their claim? That's a little bit different in which jurisdiction you are across the country. But generally speaking, you have between 2 and 5 years. Again, it's different for the claim that you're bringing, and it's different in the jurisdiction that you're in. But it is 2 years to 5 years is how long the buyer has to bring a claim. And then I got another good question here from Chris. Chris, good question. How much is the legal protection? How much does it protect the seller? We have a couple of different options that the seller can select. They can purchase up to $30,000 of protection for about $250, or they can purchase as much as $75,000 for about $1,000. So we give the seller an opportunity to pick how much protection they want. And obviously the price is different. You know, the less protection you get, the cheaper it is. The more protection you get, the more expensive it is. And we allow the seller to either take the cost of the home sale legal protection plan. They can either pay us directly at the time that they select it, or they can take it out of their closing proceeds. Thank you, Chris. Good question. All right, guys. Tina was very kind to give us an extra 5 minutes. I took it. Thank you so much. Unless we have any other questions, we're going to wrap up.
All right. I hope you all go to Seller Shield and create your account. If you haven't done so already, if you have a problem, you can chat with us on our website. You can email us. We're also in Workplace, so you can message us. I mean, there's so many ways to get a hold of us because we want to help you get in and start using it. And because I know some of you are thinking this, I'm going to tell you, we are integrating with SkySlope, and that is coming very, very soon. We are in works with them right now, and I believe it should be live for all of you in March. So we're super excited about that. So you'll be able to use it directly from SkySlope, or you can just go into Seller Shield, and it's super, super, super easy to use. Takes less than 90 seconds to send your sellers the disclosures. So if you have any questions, you need a demo, you can't get in, reach out to us because we want to help you and help separate you from the disclosure and give your sellers all that they need to reduce lawsuits and mediations. And that's it. We are out of time. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.